Okay, I think we are recording. All right. Yes, good. Good evening. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Mancos Public Library, I'd like to welcome you to a book discussion and an interview with our local author, Victor Loun. While this isn't quite as cozy as being all together at the library, it's a way that we can still keep connected and to serve the community. Victor, thank you for being with us tonight and talking about your book, The 410 Club. This is actually your second book. The first one, The Trudging of Wow, was published in 2007, and we can talk about that a little later if you want. You are a former high school English teacher who currently lives with your wife and sheep on a Mancos farm. So what kind of sheep do you have? I have to ask you that question.
They are Cormo sheep, so they're their own separate breed from Tasmania. So they're part Merino and part Corriedale, and they're primarily prized for their wool.
Yes,
It feels
indeed.
like cotton, so yeah.
Yeah. So Victor, would you talk a little bit about your book? Tell us about it, and then I'll have some questions for you when you're done.
Sure. The 410 Club, the impetus for this book actually, it occurred after two things. One, it occurred right after the Parkland school shooting, which was 2 years ago now on Valentine's Day. And the perpetrator kind of intrigued me, his backstory. And not long after that, Oprah made a comment that if you have just one person in the world that cares for you, that you probably will turn out okay. So this book kind of became an experiment on whether or not that would actually be true. So I never knew from one day to the next how the book was going to end. I really didn't know until the last chapter. And so the main character, the protagonist, this is a coming of age novel, and basically chronicles his life from about the ages of 11 up until he graduates from high school. The book is set in the 70s, and I tried very hard to chronicle and be accurate. The diction of the 70s, the lifestyle of the 70s, things that people were struggling with back then. I also grew up in the 70s, so it was easier for me to reflect on that. This book, that the protagonist, Jasper, he has a lot of adventures. On a basic level, he does such things as he goes frog gigging with his uncles. He ends up going trapping animals with them, and fairly shortly into the book, you start to see his struggle with wanting to be approved and accepted on one hand versus what his morals and what his character and virtues was telling him. And so that was a struggle for him. And so a lot of the book, he chronicles him going from one person to the next in terms of search for acceptance, and he struggles with some issues along the way that people struggled back in the 70s, and they certainly teenagers still struggle with today. As I just recently retired from being a teacher, I spent 12 years with high schoolers, and so got a bird's eye view of the type of things that concern them and cause them consternation in their life. And one of the premises is that today, especially, and even back then, that it's not like teenagers and adolescents have one issue that they're dealing with. Usually there's a multitude of issues going on at all time, and it's a lot for students to deal with. And so this book kind of came out of that. It starts off in Mancos and Cortez, and Jasper is 11 years old, and the book is written in first person. So I've had people call it or accuse me of creating a new genre called fictional memoirs. So both of my books are actually written like memoirs, but they're fictional. So they sound like it's true, but it's not. And he struggles with understanding his family and his family understanding him. Um, his mother dies when he is just barely able to remember her. So that issue kind of haunts him time and time again as he's growing up, and his desire and wish that his mother was there to help him and to console him, and what to do with that grief, because back in the 70s, not as much today, but certainly back then, it was not okay to be male and to show your feelings unless it was anger. So couldn't cry, couldn't be sad, or you would be called a weakling and that kind of stuff. And so he struggles with how to deal with that. So he struggles with his family for a while, and as a result of his mother's death, his father kind of just ignores him, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of literature out there about abuse and family growing up, and I wanted to write a book where a lot of times kids are just ignored. They're neglected as they're growing up, and what kind of effect does that have on not having any parental guidance or love or caring whatsoever? And so his dad is an alcoholic, always concerned about his drinking, and there becomes a point in Jasper's life where he really wants to connect with his father, and his father is unable to do it. What happens throughout the course of this book is that I wanted all the characters to have some redeeming quality to them. There's some characters in here that people find disturbing, or they dislike, or they downright loathe. But my belief is that everybody has some good in them. Everybody has some bad in them. So that's kind of that comes out in terms of characters that emerge and fade away in terms of the book. He spends he finds some comfort and some consolation when he meets somebody on the school bus for the first time. He ends up having to move to Maryland because his father just basically absconded and abrogated his rights as a parent. And so he ended up living with his grandmother and grandfather, who had a big farm. And so he learned a lot about farming and that way of life. And he started to go to school there, where he met a girl. He was a freshman, so his hormones raging, and this girl introduces him to church, and he becomes quickly enveloped in that, and feels loved, feels appreciated. They do lots of they have lots of adventures together where they go on church retreats and that kind of thing. And so he gets to meet all these people and to feel accepted. But at the same time, he has lots of questions about religion, about things that just don't sit right with him. And so he starts to meet with his preacher, who kind of becomes a surrogate father to him, since his own father kind of gone out of the picture. And so he asks him a lot of these questions that didn't really have good answers for. And he finds after a while that his preacher has ulterior motives for wanting to be fatherly to him, and that causes, a conundrum for Jasper, and ultimately causes him to leave the church. And so the question of revenge comes up for him, and he tries not to be like everybody else who's typical, I'm wrong, so I'm going to avenge the wrong. And he tries not to go to that place, and he waffles back and forth. And, again, as I was writing this, I had no idea from one day to the next what Jasper was going to do. In fact, there were times where I felt like, I know it's going to sound wacky, but I'm going to say it anyways, but there were times where I felt like I was kind of being channeled, and I was just writing for somebody else. I can't even explain it. And so ultimately, it's what happens in the book is that a lot of times where he's just on the edge of completely fallen into the abyss, there's someone else that always shows up to kind of care for him for however fleeting a period of time, and then they go and leave, and then someone else shows up in his life. So really, towards the end of the book, one of the purposes that I wrote the book was um, for people to think about, the following statement, and that statement is, no one is unforgivable. So the question becomes is, as you go through the book, whether or not any of these characters are absolutely unforgivable. There's no way that you can forgive them. Or is it possible to forgive everyone? And so that becomes something that he focuses on, because the his other option is to end up, literally going up in flames. And so he ends up, his uncle scoops him up and brings him back out to Colorado, and they stop off in Memphis because Jasper decides he needs to have some kind of closure with where he grew up. And so there's a lot of description of, the La Platas and trails around here. And one of the motifs that emerges is the healing power of nature, and how where everywhere else he felt like he was being betrayed and struggled with acceptance, he always felt at peace and felt at home when he was out in nature. So they stop off in Memphis because ultimately their goal was to get to California because his uncle gets a job out there. And so Jasper spends his senior year in high school with a whole bunch of people where he starts to not only gain acceptance from others, but gain acceptance of himself. And, he ultimately decides that forgiveness is what brings him the most peace, and that on some level, he recognizes that forgiveness is not for the other people, it's for himself. And so it kind of ends. There's a place in San Diego County called the Meditation Gardens. It's in Encinitas. And so he kind of ends up there and just kind of having an aha moment. And that's how the book ends. So.
It's a very real read. I think being a teenager and growing up is perilous. And I think you touched on so many critical points in this book. Now, you've talked about your inspiration being the shooting on Valentine's Day, and you have 12 years of teaching in high school as a background behind you. What other influences drew you to this book?
I think those were the two primary ones, really. And again, I didn't sit down one day and decide that I was going to write this book. It just kind of blossomed out of nothing. But primarily it was, my experiences with high school students. And I kind of miss that now that I'm retired, because they're just so, with as much as they deal with, especially now, I mean, just from the time I started teaching to the time I retired, active school shootings and active school, sessions where you practice, getting out. That didn't exist when I first started teaching. And now the coronavirus and everything that they have to deal in terms with teaching, and some of them not getting able to graduate, but the fact that they still have so much energy and so much life and so much hope, really kind of inspired me. And I tried to capture some of that in writing the novel. Having said that, though, there was always one or two students where I would be worried that one night I would see them on the news, going off. And I always had a couple of students like that, and it would break my heart, because I didn't know their story, and it was not something that they were willing to share. And so that was something that always troubled me as well.
Yeah. No, I think you did a great capture. How long did it take you once this started flowing through you? How long did it take you to get it to the first edit stage?
Uh, it's pretty amazing, actually. My first novel took me literally 15 years to write, and this took 7 months.
Wow.
So I sat down every day, and um, funny, everybody has different ways, but my writing usually became the clearest in the afternoon.
Uh-huh.
So like mid to late afternoon, I would feel things start to flow. Whereas in the morning, I just couldn't get started. So yeah, I would write every day for 4 or 5 hours, and you know, seven
Interesting
months later.
process. A lot of people say they get
Yes,
up at 5 and they write in the morning. Yeah, afternoon's your time. Yeah. So
yes.
tell me what your publishing process was like. How did you publish?
With this current book, it was a lot of research, and I had done this before with my first novel, and so a lot of it is just trying to find publishers and literary agents
Mhm.
that are amenable to your particular genre, in your particular plot line, whether it's detective or fantasy or whatever. And so I did a whole process of a lot of research and weeding out a lot of publishers that I knew wouldn't be interested, and then sending, whatever they requested, whether it was a query letter or, synopsis or a couple of the chapters, whatever they asked, I would send. Um, I'm sure, as you know, and I'm sure a lot of people who also struggle to get published know, it's kind of a catch-22 situation because, in terms of agents, at least, you'd like agents to sell your book to publishers, but a lot of agents won't even entertain you unless you've already published someone previously. And so, um, kind of, uh, I don't know how to explain how it actually occurred. It just, I guess it was meant to be. I mean, I probably sent out 50 or 60 query letters to publishers and or literary agents, and I did the same thing with my first novel. And I always remember reading about Hemingway, how he kept his first 25 publishers that he submitted to all sent him rejections, and so he kept copies of the rejection letters, and then ultimately, he got published, and the rest is history. So,
Yeah. Did you use an agent?
I did not. I
Okay.
certainly tried.
Yeah.
Yeah, my first novel, I did have an agent, and I worked with her a while, and nothing became of it, and so I ended up ultimately dropping her. But this one, I did not use an agent, so
Okay.
publisher liked
All right.
the plot.
So, referring back to that first novel, which I have not read, we do have both of them at the library now, but I've read some summaries of it. What do you see as major threads connecting them, if there are any, in fact?
There is some similarities between the two. I mean, both of them touch on addiction.
Mm-hmm.
More so in the first novel, in The Trudging of a While, than in this current novel. They both deal with grief and loss. Um, Although the grief is dealt with differently
Mm-hmm.
depending on which book you're reading. Um, I think both books have the common thread of search for something more, something
Mm-hmm.
to give your life meaning, whether it's spiritual or what have you. Both of those books have a tendency to be trudging down that path,
Yeah.
pun intended. So,
Did you always know that you had a book or two in you? Did you always want to write?
I think I did. I remember like the first thing I ever wrote. I must have been in 8th grade, and I was just kind of like a moment of clarity, and it was something that I always wanted to do. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I became an English teacher was because I did want to get closer to the writing process. I mean, I certainly read voraciously as a child and, of course, as a teacher. Um, and uh, my love of words is just absolutely overflowing. I mean, my wife will tell you that I wake her up in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning because there's a word that has woken me up that I have to change, and so I'll get up and change one word because it's that important to me. And yeah,
Wow.
I'm just language in itself is something that I hold very dear.
Yeah.
So.
What were some of your favorite books as a child?
Wow. As a
Yeah,
child
as a
or
child.
just in general?
You said you were.
Of course my, it's funny, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but my actual love of reading started because I got mono when I was like 10 years old, and my neighbor brought up over a whole grocery bag full of Hardy Boys books.
Ah.
So I started off reading the Hardy Boys, and then I read my sister's Nancy Drew books, and then as I got to high school, there were books that really moved me, all different themes, from David Copperfield to All Quiet on the Western Front to, Old Man and the Sea to Great Gatsby, and just, just a plethora of books that, as a child really moved me. So.
That Hardy Boys Nancy Drew thing is interesting to me because a colleague and I battled over that years ago. It's like, they've got to go. That's not literature. But I
Right.
wouldn't be a reader today if it hadn't been for them, so that's an
Exactly.
interesting, yeah. So what does your family think of your writing? Do they support you?
Oh, of course they do. Yeah. My wife says it's compelling, it's dark, it's disturbing. Um, there's a lot of subjects there that are hard to talk about even today.
Hmm. But they need to be
Subjects that,
talked about.
right,
Yeah,
right. Especially from, teenage boys' point of view and what's going on up here for them,
right.
and what they struggle with,
But I
and
think from a
what they think
parent
about.
or a sibling's point of view, or even a friend, this is insightful because it gives
Mm,
information to help the person working with this teen to understand or get a look at what's going on.
yeah, I have met very few teenagers in my life, myself included, that had a clear path of where they were headed, and were not frequently beset by, confusion and indecision and overanalysis. And this is something that I think teenagers struggle with a lot more often than you hear about. And you know yeah, so.
Yeah. So aside from waking your wife at 2 o'clock in the morning around a word and raising your sheep, what do you do in your downtime now that you're retired?
I have actually, I have gone back to work part-time. I am addictions counselor, so I work 3 days a week, and then the other days I'm either working on the farm or I'm writing, one or the other. So.
Nice, nice. I'm sure you're amazing in the field. Yeah. Um,
Mhm.
so were there things that you discovered in the process of writing either one of these books that surprised you?
I think basically, what I had said earlier, how much I really love the English language, and the fact that we can have so many adjectives for angry to describe the exact nuance that we want to portray in our writing. And I just truly love that. I love, also all the literary devices that we are able to use. I could, to give an analogy, I mean, as a writer, I could, make a steak and just giving you the bare essence of the meat. But for me, writing is adding things like allusion or alliteration or puns or whatever. And that's like the garlic butter on the steak, or the mushrooms on the steak, or, the sprig of rosemary on the side, things that, make it that much more appealing and much more meaningful. And that's kind of how I look at language and what it really came to me fully these last two novels about
Yeah,
how much I love the English language. So
yeah, that makes sense. Do you hear from your readers very often? Do you get feedback?
I do, I do. I'm a member of Goodreads, and so I have a lot of former students and friends that also a member of Goodreads, and they like to post um, their observations about both of those books, or I'll get reviews on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, that kind of thing. Um, so.
Yeah. As a child, before you hit those perilous teen years, what were you going to be when you grew up?
I was going to be a fireman.
Ah,
I still wish that I could be a fireman. Like a couple weeks ago when we had the East Canyon fire, I mean, I could see it from my house, and there was a part of me like wanted to jump right in there and get into that. Yeah, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a
to be a
fireman.
fireman. And so you grew up to be a wordsmith and you're putting out fires with literature.
Maybe I like it. I like it. I'll have to keep that one.
Well, I don't have any other questions for you, Victor, but is there anything else
Okay.
that you'd like to add about either one of the books or process?
Um, I think that if anybody out there wants to write a book, they should absolutely do it. I think that writing is a very cathartic process, as I'm sure that you know as well. And I think it's really important, especially people that struggle with all of the craziness that was going on inside of Jasper, that it's really important to get that stuff out of your head and onto paper. And the transformation that occurs when you do that, and that the life is not nearly as skewed as it feels like up here when you write about it, and how important that is. And um, I had a friend of mine say once, never be on your deathbed and have mortgaged your soul for something you wish you had
Mhm,
done but didn't.
mhm.
So that's something that people always wanted to do, is write a book. And by golly, I absolutely think that is a wonderful idea. So
Well, I said I was out of questions, but I'm not. Do you have another one on the way?
I do right. I do right now. It's after I finished the 410 Club, people were like, "Well, what happened to Jasper? What happened to Jasper? Are you gonna write another book?" And I wasn't really sure, and so that one's kind of sitting on the back burner from now, because what has come up for me in the last few months is I'm in the middle of a novel about a bunch of kids in school during an active shooter
Mm,
session. So having had to train for that and train students for that, you could be there several hours. And so what do you do with that time? And it's kind of Faulkner-esque in the fact that it explores what's going on outside the room from 4 or 5 different viewpoints. Students that used to be friends a long time ago, but kind of drifted apart as they got older, but now they're kind of thrust back together, and what kind of dynamics occur there. And also from the viewpoint of the teacher and what she struggles with this. And so there's a lot of backstory that goes with each of these characters. And again, I don't know how this one's going to turn out either. So,
hmm Yeah.
but yeah, that's where I'm
Well,
at right now.
good, good, good. Keep us posted. Victor, thank you
Thank you. I
so much.
will, for sure.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm definitely, your first book is on my reading list. I've read the second one and love it. Highly recommend it. It is at the library, and we're doing curbside service while we're closed, so you can call and order it up. And I'd just like to note that we are recording this on the 9th of July, 2020, during the pandemic. Thanks
Great.
again,
Thank you so
Victor.
much for having me.
We'll
Yeah,
be
I
looking
appreciate it.
forward to that second one, and maybe by that time, I mean, to the next one, to the third one, maybe by that time we can actually be all together in a room.
Yes, that would be so wonderful for
It
sure.
would, it would. But any way it happens, I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
Thank you
Thank you
again.
so much again.
Okay, good night.
Good night.